Eija Naika roughly translates to English as, "Isn't it great?" or "What the hell?" The latter is the more appropriate of the two. The event, or events, bear more than a passing resemblance to the dancing plague of 1518. While obscure in the West, the Eija Naika is one of the most fascinating events of the Japanese Meiji Restoration. The term itself comes from the phrase chanted by participants during their dancing madness. The purpose of the Eija Naika blurred the lines between mass hysteria, political demonstration, religious cult, and simple rioting. The bizarre trend emerged at the peak of the Meiji Restoration, hundreds of gatherings occurring between June 1867 to May 1868. Then it simply stopped. The hot feet cooled off. The short-lived nature of the Eija Naika and its absurdity has caused many to write it off as mass hysteria, but there was more to Japan's dancing plague in a certain way to describe it. The Eija Naika was a unique reaction towards the chaos that crippled Japan from 1853 to 1868, the chaos that would lead to the collapse of Japan's centuries-old Bakufu, or Tokugawa Shogunate, military government. The Eija Naika highlighted a growing awareness of Japan's place in the world among the common people, a reaction towards the intrusion of Western powers and philosophy into the formerly isolated nation. The country's centuries-old feudal institutions were meltdown, so the people entered one too. First appearing in 1867, the Eija Naika were defined by their festive nature against such political bleakness. Supposedly, the crazed gatherings full of costumes, dancing, and sometimes looting were in reaction to religious miracles. The Furafuri, or unexplained talisman rain, ignited the people into a religious frenzy. The gatherings became a nihilistic celebration that celebrated what the hell. When society is collapsing, apparently people turn to dancing? The Eija Naika were the culmination of more than a decade of disasters that had commenced for Japan in 1853-1854. After Japan had instated Sakoku, or closed country, in the early 1600s, the Japanese idea of Westerners was the field of fantasy, informed only by brief, isolated interactions with shipwrecked whalers. The Japanese regarded Westerners as southern barbarians, because Europeans sailed in from the south, or red hairs. Most pre-1853 images depicted Europeans as demons who had come across the magical Pacific. Americans were even less known, and the only description declared they were pugnacious and loved to fight. Though Japan had maintained a minimal trade with the Dutch through Dejima, the American expedition of 1853-1854 would forcibly induct the island nation into global politics. Commodore Perry's Black Ships opened Japan to Western influence in the most traumatic way possible. By literal gunboat diplomacy, the American Commodore opened Japanese ports for trade, the start of the end for the shogunate government which could not adapt. The Convention of Kanagawa in 1854 destroyed the Tokugawa Shogunate's governing edict. The decentralized, militaristic Bakufu, or tent government, depended upon the equilibrium that had prevailed in Japan for the last 200 years. The treaty represented nothing less than a total challenge to Japanese philosophy. The American Black Ships, or steamships, had destroyed the illusion of Japanese invincibility. Even among the commoners, the belief of Japan's supremacy was faltering. The influx of foreign, free market trade began the breakdown of Japan's feudal system, which was already in decline. What was formerly economic stagnation became economic collapse. While the Western powers desired an open Japan, they did not desire a conquered Japan. The bureaucratic shogunate had few friends among the Western empires, who, through trade concessions, inflicted embarrassment upon embarrassment on Japan, made even worse by the fact Tokugawa Hisada, the shogun from 1853 to 1858, was physically weak, incompetent, possibly mentally disabled, and had to rely on his feuding factions of ministers to rule. American contact would induct more than a decade of disasters from 1853 to 1868. An awful 15 years foreshadowed by comets across Japan in 1858, 1861, and 1862, symbols of great calamity and great change. The opening of trade led to the collapse of purchasing power all across Japan. In response, the domestic Japanese market saw price gouging by rice, soy sauce, and sake merchants across Japan, three of the country's most basic goods. Economic migrancy then led to the collapse of Japan's ossified feudal system, which had supported the Tokugawa shogunate's social order. a government which natural disasters revealed as now totally incompetent. In 1853 and 1855, massive earthquakes struck around the capital of Edo, crippling it. This was followed by immense fires in 1859 and 2 others in 1866. Trust in the government finally collapsed when Japan suffered a cholera epidemic in 1858 and measles epidemic in 1862, both diseases introduced by Western sailors in trade ports. In Edo, the cholera casualties were estimated at 20,000 to 30,000 dead out of the national 300,000, and even the shogun Eisada was among them. Bodies lined the streets for days as the government was unable to respond to the crisis. The loss of reputation was a death blow for the shogunate, which, due to its decentralized nature, depended upon its reputation to rule. In response to threats within Japan, supposedly, 123 severed heads were displayed across Edo from 1862 to 1865 as an impotent display of power. Lacking a truly centralized military force, the Tokugawa clan's threats of force were absolutely empty. A consensus emerged among Japan's feudal lords the shogunate had lost the right to rule. The last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, in response, enacted Taisei Hokan, or a conciliatory plan which would slowly cede power to a governmental council and eventually back to the emperor. In reality, it was an exit strategy by the Tokugawa clan to retain their generational wealth and lands, a scheme which led to the already Western-influenced lords of Choshu and Satsuma to raise the banner of rebellion. A rebellion which from 1868 to 1869 became the Boshin War, resulting in the restoration of power to the Japanese emperor in the Meiji Restoration. In response to national collapse, the common people turned towards religion for comfort, a common trend throughout the many crises in Japanese history. In Japan's native faith of Shinto, pilgrimages to shrines were a well-established tradition. The Great Tokaido Pilgrimage Road facilitated mass movement across the country. Despite rising violence, pilgrimages actually increased from 1853 to 1868. Many trekked to the Ise Grand Shrine, Japan's major shrine dedicated to the sun goddess Amaterasu, to beseech the goddess to preserve Japan. Others prayed the foreigners that threatened the country might be destroyed. Emotions ran high across both city and countryside. In a strange response to bleak circumstances, religious festivals prevailed across the country. In hopes of preserving Japan, the shrines employed kaicho, or exhibition of images, the display of religious relics to the public. These objects often employed in restorative festivals that hope to restore both personal and national health, now used to expunge the doubt creeping across Japan's national consciousness. The dancing craze seems to have begun in early June or July, when harvest festival dancing, odori, was common. What emerged from the era of confusion is still debated. What happened next is reported as fudafuri, or talisman rain, the unexplained falling of religious objects from the sky, often in fortunate circumstances, not unlike a rain of frogs or fishes. These trinkets were the fuda, or religious papers often obtained at shrines to bring good luck, good health, or good fortune. In other cases, what fell from the sky was not the paper fuda, but stones, metals, ceramics, often religious in nature, and, supposedly, even body parts at some points. The occurrence of the Eija Ka followed these fudafuri, or talisman rains. Wherever it happened, people would be whipped into a frenzy, or a sort of a ritual rebellion, pilgrims often bolstering the numbers of participants. Most of the Eija Ka instances happened on the Pacific coast, probably in reaction to Western intrusion, often in urban, though not exclusively so, areas. The celebrants would shout Eija Ka, an exclamation meaning "this is great" or "what the hell," as they went upon their parading through houses and streets. Seeming to embrace the absolute absurdity of the event, while most of the Eija Ka demonstrations were peaceful, there were a few unlucky merchants on the wrong side of the hysteria come riots. Merchants guilty of price gouging, and sometimes even just innocent merchants, had their houses sacked. The crowds would totally strip these dwellings, stealing literally everything not nailed down. Other times, the crowds demanded the immediate expulsion of all foreigners from Japan. Actual incidents of physical violence, though, beside looting, were rather rare. The events were often infectious, spreading across communities where fudafuri occurred, and often lasting 3 or 4 days. Though the participants trended younger, the Eija Ka celebrants included men, women, and children. The events often began as family gatherings, escalated into community celebrations, until the happiness turned the group into a bacchanal riot. It seems much of the activity of the Eija Ka, at their apex, was intended to embrace primal Japaneseness and offend Western Christian sensibility. The demonstrations focused upon the celebration of the gods in Japanese tradition. Cross-dressing of both men and women was common in them. Others would don costumes, like those of foxes, and act as if they were magical. Chanting, dancing, and parading were the most basic element of the Eija Naika phenomena. As an eyewitness to one of the Eija Naika demonstrations, the British diplomat Ernest Mason Sato gave a rare Western description of the events. We found the whole population occupied with festivities in honor of the approaching opening of the city to foreign trade. Crowds of people in holiday garb dancing and singing Eija Naika, Eija Naika. Isn't it good? Houses decorated with rice cakes in all colors, oranges, little bags, straws, and flowers. The dresses worn were chiefly red crepe, a few blue and purple. Many of the dancers carried red lanterns on their heads. The pretext for these rejoicings was a shower of pieces of paper bearing the name of the two gods of Ise, alleged to have taken place recently. An honest enough, if somewhat misinterpreted, description of the events often written off by foreigners. As is obvious in the costumes and almost orgasmic purpose of the Eija Naika, the celebrations were deeply rooted in Japanese mythology and folk religion. The chants often invoked the gods, like at shrines, to guide and protect Japan, as one declared in hopes for the future, rendered in English translation. But then, it was frightfully bad year, 1866, and best forgotten. Thanks to the kami, gods, we shall dance, right? Right. Right on. Remaking the world of Japan is right, too, no? Yes. Go for it. Congratulations are due on the good fortune of a bountiful harvest. So let's dance on it. This transcendent promise of good fortune through religious convulsions was not unique to the Eija Naika phenomenon, though. Millenarianism movements, those who seek societal change through a mass religious event, often a prophecy of apocalyptic tone, are a common form of stress-induced response to disasters beyond personal control, all across the globe, often adopting some vague form of religious apocalypticism in reaction to Western Christianity. Mass hysteria that spread through entire communities resulted from the collapse of the formerly impervious shogunate, a total, traumatic shift in the order-based Japanese society. The belief the gods would liberate Japan and restore the proper order was nothing less than a religious revelation. Pilgrims often called upon these new Yanoshi gods, products of new religious movements, to bring about a world renewal. As the representative of heaven's will on earth then, it is no surprise the emperor became the fetishistic object for some varieties of the Eija Naika. Many siding with the pro-imperial Satsuma and Shoshu rebels during the Boshin War to literally remake Japan politically. The Sono-Joy movement/slogan becoming popular among the celebrants, which declared, "Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians," or as it was expressed in song, "The gods will descend to Japan, while rocks fall on the foreigners in their residencies. Eija Naika, Eija Naika." Most analysis of the political dimension of the Eija Naika regarded as a sort of mock revolt then. Even this somewhat blurs the tangled religious, political, and hysteric nature of the unorganized events, though. Due to years of disaster-induced austerity and Western military threat, the Japanese peasantry had no legitimate form of revolt or even outlet. Instead, the civil disorder of the Eija Naika became another form of rebellion. As George M. Wilson wrote in Plots and Motives in Japan's Meiji Restoration, rural uprisings went from 106 in 1866 to 34 in 1867, then 108 in 1868. Why the massive decrease? The Eija Naika seems to have absorbed that impulse/energy during 1867. Then there is also the serendipitous nature of these mock revolts. The Eija Naika always seemed to assist the Satsuma and Shoshu rebels in their aims to restore the power of the emperor, literally assist the pro-imperial forces supporting the powerless emperor by crippling the movement of shogunate forces through cities, as well as distracting police. As the lucky Furafuri rain always seemed to coincidentally occur in pro-Bakufu cities in the north of Japan. During the early days of the Boshin War, these displays of public madness always seemed to coincide with the movement of pro-imperial forces, made even more suspect that by 1869, when the emperor was restored and the Boshin War concluded, the Eija Naika had totally burned out. Had their goals simply been fulfilled? Perhaps the Satsuma and Shoshu lords had more to do with the Eija Naika than first seems. Accusations of conspiracy and sabotage have always rolled around these random occurrences. While the conspiracy thesis has never been widely accepted, There are a few interesting pieces of evidence to support it, beside the always seemingly pro-imperial nature of these supposedly random events. As they crippled the Tokugawa government's urban administration, the Eija Naika may have been artificially stoked in major Japanese cities by the shogunate's enemies. Samurai in red kimonos were often reported in the crowds before the Fudafuri reign began or celebrations commenced. In retrospect, the events seem to have followed these mysterious marked red samurai. While mass hysteria may explain away these reoccurring red samurai, there is substantial proof they did exist in one arrest. Bakufu police arrested a rogue samurai who was found to be in possession of thousands of shrine amulets. Then, 3 woodworkers, unconnected to the samurai, were found guilty of stoking riots by throwing talismans from the top of buildings. Odd. Though maybe conspiracy gives one a too safe explanation in this very strange case. The Eija Naika were incredibly brief events that coincided with the peak of Japanese civil strife. Starting in June 1867, they largely, unexplainably, stopped by 1868. Maybe the people just got tired of dancing? Though history will always be scattered with such events. Religious hysteria in reaction to disaster is not unique to the Eija Naika, nor is dancing, apparently. The near-contemporaneous Taiping Rebellion stemmed from the same concerns in China, but had a near infinitely higher level of human casualty. Perhaps the greatest truth of the Eija Naika is that it has no true English translation. Both purposefully and accidentally so, if it was all an accident. After dancing the day away, I'd like to thank my patron, The Single Way Out.